Hello and welcome to Sharpe Pritchard's webinar today. I'm Julie Bann and I'm an employment partner here at Sharpe Pritchard, and I'm going to be joined by my colleague Kit, and together we're going to navigate through the employment law implications of COVID-19 and specifically testing and the vaccination programme. So just by way of summary, onto the next slide, we're going to look at whether as an employer you can require your workforce to be tested. And then we're going to look at vaccinations and whether you as an employer can require your workforce to be vaccinated, and managing COVID-19 going forward, and the legal risks of any such enforcement policy and the best practices if you choose to introduce such a policy. So, starting off, I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has been and is a vicious virus, and it is highly infectious and has caused a national crisis. We're in an extraordinary situation where most businesses are in lockdown and offices and workplaces are deserted. But for you within the public sector, you've been taking the brunt of this pandemic. Your workers have had to continue working, alongside colleagues and in frontline roles and in direct contact with members of the public. And therefore the impact to you has been, we completely acknowledge, has been significant. We feel like we're turning the tide with the approval of the 3 vaccines in short succession over December and the beginning of January. And while there's been a huge amount of information or false news regarding the safety of the vaccines, from what we gather, they have been subject to rigorous testing and have been considered and are considered safe for the vast majority of the members of the public. Now, the government has introduced their vaccine programme and aimed to vaccinate 15 million people, all those over the age of 70 and above, healthcare workers and extremely vulnerable people by mid-February, and they are well on the way to doing that. As you can see on our slide, as of the 1st of February, 9 million had received their first jab, and I understand as of yesterday, we're now over 10 million. So that programme has been incredibly effective in moving towards that aim and hopefully bringing us out of lockdown. So if we move on to the next slide, the question is, bearing in mind, we've all been locked down since March, April, and the impact of that on the economy, on mental health, on the number of people who have died and the impact on their families, the number of people who are still seriously ill, you would expect that everybody would be interested in receiving the vaccine. But as you can see from the statistics from research that was undertaken in December 2020, the Royal Society for Public Health undertook research, and they found that 76% of the UK public would accept the COVID-19 vaccine, but that went down to 50% when answered by people with BAME backgrounds. And that is a significant drop, but would also consider that 76% means that 24% of the UK public are reluctant to take the vaccine. Now, we would say that having the vaccine is protecting yourself, it's protecting the wider, anyone that you come into contact with, and protecting members of the public. And as an organisation, as an employer, you have a duty to comply with health and safety requirements and maintain health, safe working environment. And as such, having a policy in place where everybody should protect themselves or be protected against the vaccine is a serious consideration. And also, from your perspective, you are the public front, local authority, your staff are your face of your public facing, they're the face of your organisation, and it it's important that you are seen to boost public confidence in the vaccination policy by ensuring that your staff are also covered. As you can see at the top of the slide, Pimlico plumbers, that bastion of good employment practices, claimed, or the Guardian claimed in December, that they were going to introduce a no jab, no job work contract. And while it seems quite harsh, you could understand why people would go down that route. Plumbers, such as a whole host of people, are expected to go into people's homes. And if you're a homeowner and you're accepting a plumber in your home, you would expect them to have taken all safety precautions, including being vaccinated. And so you can understand it from that perspective. So if you can move on to the next slide. I'm going to pass you on to Kit, and he will look firstly at whether employees can expect you to take a COVID-19 test.
Yes, thank you, Julie. So before we turn to consider the vaccination programme, I'm going to have a quick look at the testing programme and whether it could be mandatory for employees. Now, we're acutely aware of the severe disruption that COVID-19 is causing the workforce, with often employees having to self-isolate or sick with COVID-19 for extended periods. I'm sure everyone on this call will be very aware of the government legislation that requires you to self-isolate for 10 days if you have COVID-19 symptoms. Government guidance goes on to state that employers should not advise employees to seek out a test from NHS unless they have symptoms. The NHS has a finite supply of tests, and so these shouldn't be depleted on employees just seeking to return to the office safely. However, government guidance does go on to state that private provision may be possible. However, it's important to remember that there is no obligation on employers to run testing programs. Ultimately, when deciding whether to implement some form of testing policy for your business, the key thing to consider is proportionality. You need to look at your business and understand the role of staff. Is it difficult to maintain social distancing? Are they in direct contact with the public? Or are they working with at-risk groups? If these issues are present within your workforce, then it may be proportional to implement some form of testing regime. However, if most of your staff are working from home on a permanent basis, then of course it would be far less proportionate to impose a testing regimen. The government and ACAS have provided useful guidance on this matter. Looking at the ACAS guidance, it works through the key steps an employer may need to consider if they decide to implement some form of mandatory testing for their employees. It starts with consultation. You need to engage and agree the policy with employees. There might be a plethora of different reasons an employee may not want to be tested. If you actually think about how a test works in practice, it is very invasive. A swab goes up your nose, and so of course there may be reasonable reasons that an employee may be opposed to taking a test. Moving on, it seems obvious, but it is absolutely key that any agreement is made in writing. This could just be an update to the policy. If it's in writing, it will provide clarity to the employees and the employer and remove any ambiguity as you move into quite a novel and difficult area. And finally, flexibility needs to be adopted by the employer. As I mentioned, there might be very good reasons for employees not wanting to be tested. And so if you jump straight to any form of disciplinary action for not taking a test, it could have adverse results, such as a potential employment claim. It's far better to respond flexibly to any issues raised and work with the employee to navigate them. Thank you. I'll now turn to the next slide.
And we move back to me now. So can employers require their workforce to be vaccinated? The short answer is no. The vaccine is not compulsory. The government can't require people to be vaccinated. The Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 provides that a person must not be required to undergo medical treatment. Medical treatment includes vaccination. And while the Coronavirus Act only extended that prohibition to Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to be very difficult to justify it in any other way. So short of pinning your employee down, it's very difficult to see how you could force somebody to be vaccinated. A vaccination by itself, it should be voluntary and done with informed consent. And the other risk is that if you force someone to be vaccinated against their will, you are effectively causing them an unlawful injury, and it could be a criminal act. And none of us want to go down that route. So putting it in an employment context, is it possible that you could bring in a policy where employees are required to have the vaccine or face disciplinary action, including their dismissal? So can you effectively dismiss an employee if they refuse to have the vaccine? If we can move on to the next slide. The answer to this is yes, you can. You can dismiss anybody should you wish to do so, but not in this situation without significant risk. So if we go through the thought process and see how it would come out in each stage. In order to dismiss somebody fairly, you have to have a potentially fair reason to dismiss. So your reason in this situation would be that you have brought in a policy where you're requiring your staff to be vaccinated. And the reason for that policy is under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, you are obliged to take reasonable steps to reduce any workplace risks. And it is your view that the best way of doing that, the most proportionate way of and effective way of doing that, is to expect your employees to be vaccinated. There may also be operational reasons, in certain, in the context of some of your services, there may be an operational need for your employees to be vaccinated. There may be stronger justification for that instruction on the basis they're working directly with members of the public or in direct contact with their colleagues where social distancing isn't possible. So you'd start with your reason for dismissal would be a failure to comply with reasonable instruction. And you'd then look at what the potential risk is if you dismissed for that reason. And you've got two potential risks. The first is an unfair dismissal claim, and the second could be a potential discrimination claim. And if we go on to the next slide, please. Looking at the unfair dismissal claim, your key risk, clearly, is any employee with over 2 years service, qualifying service with you. So if you have if you dismiss someone with over 2 years service, we would argue that there is a significant risk that you would get an outcome of unfair dismissal should you dismissed an employee and they took you to an employment tribunal. There are 4 reasons for this. Firstly, there is no legal obligation to be vaccinated. So an employment tribunal is unlikely to look favourably on an employer who has dismissed an employee for refusing to be vaccinated if it's not mandatory in the UK. And secondly, there are issues regarding the Human Rights Act. So the Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, or the European Convention of Human Rights, protects people from being interfered with physically or psychologically, and that includes mandatory vaccinations. So as a public sector organisation, you could have a human rights element to any potential claim as well. Thirdly, there is a section of the public that have a genuine belief that the vaccine is dangerous. They're concerned about the side effects, they're concerned about how it's been tested, they're concerned about how it's been manufactured and the method of how it operates, they're concerned about how it's stored, and a variety of things. There's been a whole host of stories and facts that have been spread across social media and directed to certain sections of the community where people will have vaccine hesitancy, and it would be wrong to label all people that are vaccine hesitant as people that are anti-vaxxers. And it would be difficult for you to argue that forcing someone to have a vaccine where you are overriding their genuine concerns about their safety is fair and is a genuine and reasonable instruction in the circumstances. Fourthly, there is a small percentage of the public that would or may have an adverse reaction to the injection and have some serious side effects. So effectively, by bringing in a policy, a blanket policy where everyone has to be vaccinated or face dismissal, you are effectively compelling members of staff to be vaccinated and put their health and safety at risk in doing so. So as a whole, we consider that anybody that was dismissed for refusing to have a vaccine would have a very arguable unfair dismissal claim. Now, clearly, if you dismiss someone and they bring an unfair dismissal claim, that claim is not going to be heard at the moment for 12, possibly 18 months. I mean, we've heard in the papers earlier this week the state of the employment tribunals at the moment. And if you've got experience of it, they are absolutely overwhelmed and are struggling to deal with the cases that they've already got, not taking into account any that would arise as a result of this pandemic. So any compensation that is likely to receive any hearing is going to be well outside the era of the pandemic, and therefore not necessarily be in the same way in the public interest as it would be if it was heard today, for example. But still, having that risk is something that you need to bear in mind. Now, we do think there are exceptional situations where you may be able to justify a policy of dismissing employees who refuse to have the vaccine. And by this, we're talking about specific roles where the individuals are at risk of exposure or of exposing others. And we're looking here at care work, anybody that worked within health services, anybody working with vulnerable people. In those specific situations, you may be able to argue that it's actually a genuine occupational requirement for your employees to be protected and to be protecting others that they come into contact with. And therefore, you may be able to argue that it is asking or expecting all your staff in those roles to be vaccinated is a proportionate means of achieving your legitimate aim. Your legitimate aims are protecting the health and safety of your employees, protecting the health and safety of members of the public that they come in contact with, protecting public confidence in your organisation, that your employees, you're potentially going into people's homes, are not going to be at risk of infecting those individuals that they come into contact with. And all those factors would be aspects that you could use if you chose to take the risk and justify a policy for specific roles. I think it's also fair to bear in mind in considering this issue the reputational risk to your organisation if you had an employee who refused to have the vaccine, who came into contact with a member of the public or a vulnerable member of the public particularly, and that person caught COVID as a result of that interaction. It would have a significant impact on the reputation of your organisation, and I think it's something that you could bear in mind when determining whether you would proceed with this policy. If we can move on to the next slide. So, bearing in mind, we think any blanket policy is high risk, and any policy looking at sort of exceptional workers is still of a level of risk. Even if you have a fair reason for a dismissal, you have to follow a fair process, and you have to be able to show that dismissal is reasonable, as fair and reasonable in all the circumstances known to you at that time. So it's fair to dismiss that particular person with all the circumstances that you're aware of. And therefore, it is important, in fact, it's fundamental that you follow a reasonable and fair process. By this, we mean full consultation on any policy, setting out the rationale for the policy, any evidence that you have to show that the vaccination is going to protect the individual and protect others from the risk. Full communication of that, and then how it is applied on a case-by-case basis. So individual consultation, a full opportunity for the employee to explain any vaccination hesitancy, and a full consideration of that position. And then all alternatives should be explored before you reach the decision to dismiss. And it may be looking at permanent or temporary redeployment, paid or unpaid leave, or it may be down to restricting their access to certain parts of your building, such as the staff canteen or other areas that they're going to bring people at, put other people at risk. It's not. It's a no-win situation, I would say, in all respects. But it's something that you may consider going forward. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, please. What about any action short of dismissal? So what about disciplining someone or alternatives short of disciplinary action? And the question you'd have to ask yourself is what benefit you would get from disciplining an employee who refused to accept a vaccination. Are there going to be issues regarding staff morale? Are there going to be concerns regarding the way that the way that you apply that, and what is going to be the benefit? How are you going to be able to regulate it if they refuse to accept the vaccination? It's a one-off event, and that person still isn't vaccinated. The alternatives, such as redeployment or, as I say, restricting certain areas of building, the risk of anything short of dismissal is that employee may consider that you have fundamentally breached their contract of employment by bringing in your policy of vaccination and by disciplining them for refusing to go against their own views in being vaccinated, and claim constructive unfair dismissal. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, it's always slightly easier to defend a constructive unfair dismissal claim than it is to defend an unfair dismissal claim, because the burden is on the individual to show that there is a fundamental breach. And you also have to consider that what is the potential risk of somebody leaving their job because of being disciplined or being forced to accept a redeployment, especially if that job is vocational. But it is something to factor in. If we can move on to the next slide. So we've looked at unfair dismissal and whether you could dismiss someone for refusing to be vaccinated. The other risk is a potential discrimination claim. Now, we think discrimination claims, while potentially arguable, are not as strong as an unfair dismissal claim for a number of reasons. So if you look at the types of claim that you could potentially have, and we look firstly at a claim that that any policy for forcing employees to be vaccinated is indirectly discriminatory against someone because of their religion or philosophical belief. So that they would argue that someone of their specific religion is being substantially disadvantaged by the policy in comparison to someone who doesn't have that religion. And as you can see from the statistics earlier, there is a significant percentage of the BAME population that are hesitant about having the vaccine. And it's not clear whether that hesitancy arises from any religious belief. There has been a number of claims spread across social media regarding whether the vaccine is halal, but my understanding that it is, and I've seen reports from eminent imams who have confirmed that it is halal and it's someone's moral duty to be vaccinated in the circumstances. But there is that issue to consider, and it's not the strongest argument that someone could run, but it is an argument that people may run. The other issue is whether an employee could argue that their beliefs regarding anti-vaccination is a philosophical belief. Now, to be a philosophical belief, your belief has to be genuinely held, it's cogent and serious, and applies to an important aspect of human life or behaviour. It must be worthy of respect in a democratic society and not affect other people's fundamental rights. And so it's theoretically possible that someone with a belief that vaccinations are abhorrent, or however they want to put it, could amount to a philosophical belief. I think it's a weak argument, but it is there. Another potential argument is age discrimination on the basis that younger members of the population are going to be the last to receive the vaccine, and so may be indirectly penalised by any policy. And then you have concerns regarding disability. So vaccine hesitancy or anxiety about vaccines is unlikely to constitute a disability in itself, but there may be certain disabilities or conditions that mean the employee is unable to take the vaccine safely. And by having a policy whereby everyone has to have the vaccination, you are going to force employees who have not advised you of that particular condition because they don't think it's relevant to their day-to-day activities with you. You're going to force them to notify you of that condition, which they may not have felt the need to tell you otherwise. You are then on notice of that and have to act accordingly. And finally, there's the concern regarding pregnant women. So my understanding is it isn't advisable for pregnant women to take the vaccine or people that want to be pregnant. So if you had a policy criterion or practice for making the vaccination mandatory within your workplace, you are effectively outing any employee who is either at early stages of pregnancy or is trying to get pregnant and hasn't had the vaccine, and that in itself could amount to a discrimination complaint. So there's all sorts of aspects in terms of discrimination complaints, and while we consider that they are weak, we all know that the fact that a discrimination claim is weak does not mean that people won't pursue it. And the difficulty you have in employment tribunals is that the higher level of tribunals, the Court of Appeal, etc., has determined that you can't just strike out discrimination claims without hearing evidence. So these discrimination claims are allowed to run. And I don't know if you saw the Times, the reporting in the Times at the beginning of this week about the state of the employment tribunals and some of the claims that have been allowed to run and the cost to the employer of defending them. So it's something that is always going to be there. That's always a risk in your workplace. So moving on to the next slide, please. I'm going to now ask Kit just to cover the data protection implications of any such policy. Thanks, Kit.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. As with many areas of employment law, data protection legislation is pervasive and must be adhered to. Employers must make sure they follow data protection law if they test staff for COVID-19 or require staff to be vaccinated. Running through data protection legislation are the principles of transparency, fairness, and proportionality. These must be closely adhered to and considered in all aspects of such a sensitive area. When you will be obtaining health information about an individual in these scenarios. This will be classed as a special category of personal data, and therefore there are more onerous requirements when you are processing that data. Under the GDPR and Data Protection Act, you may have a justification for processing this data. For public and private sector employers, this will be on the basis of legitimate interests, And for just public sector bodies, you may also be able to justify it as a substantial public interest. However, there are a few key points to be aware of when you're processing this sensitive health data. Those include: do not disclose the identity of the employees who have been tested or vaccinated. Do not collect unnecessary or excessive information. This is all about restricting the amount of sensitive data you're processing and ensuring it's proportionate to the aims of your organisation. It is also worth remembering that explicit consent given by employees may not be sufficient in this scenario. As an employer, you're in a position of power over your employees, and therefore an employee may not be considered to be freely giving their consent. This is because you hold leverage over them, and even if they do consent, there is the risk that they can be dismissed. The best way of capturing all these checks and balances effectively and robustly is through a data protection impact assessment. A DPIA easily demonstrates compliance and accountability and provides a good amount of paperwork for you to demonstrate this. Moving on, you must be careful to inform staff of what personal data is required, what it will be used for, who it will be shared with, how long it will be kept for, and what decisions will be made based on the test results. This seems obvious, but ultimately it's about having the sufficient safeguards in place in an area where the data you will be processing is very sensitive. Thank you. I'll now turn to Julie again for the next slide.
Thank you, Kit. So we'd also add in another issue, and that is if you have employees who are avid anti-vaxxers who regularly share their online through their social media and otherwise fake news, harassing messages to individuals, or spreading unsubstantiated claims. We've had a lot of news reports recently about how members of medical staff have been hounded by such messages over the course of this pandemic. And what can you do if one of your members of staff, who through their social media provides a direct connection with you? So it may be on their social media site that it is well known that they are an employee of your organisation. As a public sector body, you are at the forefront of educating the public on safe practices and assisting in the vaccination programme. And having a member of staff who's passing around such messages in direct conflict with the safety messages that you would be yourself promoting could result in reputational damage. And therefore, the question is, what can you do about it? Well, I think we've all been in a position where you will often have been in a position where you have somebody who, through their social media, has undertaken activities that you really would not want to be connected to your organisation. But this is something quite serious. The anti-vax message is quite onerous, and it is contributing to the vaccine hesitancy among the members of the public. First thing we would suggest that you do, the initial step, would be to undertake an investigation. So to look at the specific social media sites and to notify the employee that you're aware of them, check that they have actually produced those messages, that they are their messages, and advise the employee of your social media policies and related policies. Confirm the code of conduct that you expect of your employees and the values that you expect them to display in public where there is any connection with your workplace. The fact that their anti-vaccine messages are outside the course of their employment in itself doesn't mean to say that you can't take action if by their actions they are directly connecting you with their message. Secondly, if they persist after you've advised them that their actions are inappropriate in spreading the news or continue with their social media site, it is potentially fair reason for dismissal. And you'd have to do so on the basis of some other substantial reason, because there's a genuine risk of damage to your reputation in their continued actions. It's crucial that you have a thorough and effective investigation into the facts of the case to enable you to make a reasonable judgment about the approach to take. And it's fair for you to argue that their public views that they are displaying on a public basis and either internally or externally are not compatible with your values and are causing you reputational damage. The key reason for dismissal must be made clear to the employee and follow your usual process. Now, it's likely you're going to have a specific process for any of your processes where you are for performance or disciplinary. You will have a fair step-by-step process to follow, and you can use that in such situations if you needed to do so. And moving on to the next slide, please, Kit. So practical advice. Now, we've gone through today the risks associated with having any form of policy in place that compels your staff to be vaccinated. But it may be that weighing up all those risks, you still consider it is appropriate for you to initiate such a policy. And that is obviously a decision that you can take, bearing in mind those risks. Any form of employment practice, there are risks, and you balance where you want to be in those risks, and you justify your decisions. So that is something that you'd have to do. And before you go down any route, ensure that you have your clear rationale as to why you're going to do it. And then you have some form of clear communication as to that rationale. The first step should be to try and engage your staff voluntarily in accepting the vaccination. So support your staff in getting the vaccine in very clear ways. So providing them with factual material regarding the safety of the vaccination, allowing staff to be vaccinated in working hours, so taking time off to take the vaccine, facilitating their opportunity to do so, supporting and encouraging as much as possible in taking the inoculation. If members of staff express hesitancy, give them opportunities to speak to your you may have an outsourced sort of medical advice line or your occupational health providers, or you may have some form of benefit where they can access counselling. So refer them to places where they can, signpost them to places where they can obtain further information. They can talk to somebody about their hesitancy and how to manage that. And consider all alternatives. So look at adjusting working practices or reallocating work, and do that through consultation. So thank you very much for your time. What I should have said at the beginning of the talk, obviously I got straight in there, was that we're going to take questions at the end to make it simpler. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And I think we have some questions now that I'm going to go through. Oh, have I missed a slide? Sorry, Kit, do you want to just go back? Sorry. Yeah, I think I've concluded anyway, but there are significant risks in dismissing or disciplining an employee who refuses a vaccination. Dismissal should be an absolute last resort if you cannot persuade them to voluntarily accept the vaccination. But we do think there are certain exceptions to that rule where they are in specific roles working with extremely vulnerable people on with direct contact with members of the public, where you could justify any such policy. Thank you for that. I will now move on to the questions. So your test results. Is this something you've looked at?
Sorry, Julie, you cut out just then. Could you repeat that?
Oh yes, sorry. The question is, if you ask your staff to be tested and they have a negative result, are they required to report the negative test result?
So this goes to setting up an effective testing policy at the outset. So the point of having a mandatory or potentially optional testing facility is to ensure you are aware your staff are returning to the office or their place of work and they don't have COVID. And so it will be in your interest to know if they have, whether they do have COVID or not. However, again, turning to the data protection issue, you need to limit the amount of people that will be aware of this information. So just you as the employer and their employee will be aware of whether the test has been negative or positive. This can be clearly outlined in the initial policy that you agree with the employees. So they'll be clear if they've taken this test, who do they notify and how will that information be contained?
Thanks, Kit. That's really helpful, and I think it's obviously to the benefit of the employee to notify you that they've got a negative test result as well, unless by self-isolating for a longer period of time, that means that they get, they're considering it's extra time off work. But that was a good answer, Kit. Thank you. The next question is, and this is also a really good question, that the understanding is that the vaccination means that you won't suffer extremely, you're not likely to die as a result of getting COVID, but you can still catch it and you can still pass it on. Therefore, could it be argued the employees can't insist on employees taking the vaccine if it doesn't actually stop you infecting others? I think this is a really good question, and I think it's still something that is subject to research as to the effectiveness of the vaccine in the infection rates and the likelihood that you could still catch it and pass it on. And it is something that would have to inform your policy, because if by having a policy of mandatory vaccinations, you are effectively going against Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, you have to show that your policy is a proportionate means of achieving that aim. And one of the aspects of doing that, you're going to have to be able to establish for your own benefit and for your employees of why it is a proportionate means of establishing that aim. And if the concern is actually it's not going to do what you think it will do, so it's not going to keep other people safe, then your argument is going to be weakened as a result of that. The next question is, can an employee insist that colleagues wear masks in the office while sitting near them? Now, this is a really good question. I know from experience of working with colleagues clients in Spain that they're all expected to wear masks throughout the day in their office environment, and a lot of other countries have brought in a similar rule. The question here is whether you as an employer want to bring in a policy that everyone wears masks, or that an employee feels comfortable in approaching that colleague directly or approaching you and asking that colleague to wear a mask. There may be specific reasons why that individual feels more concerned about attending the workplace and sitting near people that don't have masks on. And you have to consider that, and I think you've got to have a flexible approach to the situation. And it may be that if someone has that level of anxiety about working near colleagues that don't wear a mask, that you consider alternatives to forcing someone to wear a mask if they're also not comfortable in doing so. But it's something to consider in terms of a general policy. It's something to consider in terms of specific situations. I think what COVID has done is bring to light how flexible we need to be as employers in adapting to suit not only the situation that's happening across the country, but also what may be specifically happening for your individual employees. Now, can I scroll down? I can't. Let's just dismiss those ones. Can employees insist that they will not attend work until they've had the vaccine? The answer to that is no, they can't insist that they will not attend work. You as an employer are responsible for maintaining health and safety in the workplace. And if you have determined that your workplace is as COVID secure as it possibly can be, and you've followed public health guidance in terms of bringing in place the procedures to reduce or minimise any risk, then an individual cannot say, I will not work until I've had the vaccine, because you have no control over the vaccine when they get that vaccine, or how effective that vaccine will be for that specific individual. And therefore, it's not something that they can insist on. What I would do in that situation, again, is be flexible, have a full consultation with that individual to discuss their specific anxieties, see if there are any alternatives for that individual other than attending work. And if not, then you can expect them to work or put them on unpaid leave until they are willing to attend the workplace. Can an employee be dismissed for spreading misinformation about COVID? Example, telling colleagues that the vaccine doesn't work and COVID is not real. So spreading those conspiracy theories that has a negative effect on colleagues. I think this comes back to that last issue in terms of whether their actions are compatible with your values and with the message that you are spreading. And this is very similar, I would suggest, to situations such as you may recall the case of the registrars who, the Christian registrars who refused to marry same-sex couples, and that sort of balancing of rights. And ultimately, in this situation, the employee, they may genuinely believe the information that they are spreading, but it isn't compatible with your values and isn't compatible with the public health message. And you are a public sector organisation, you're expected to comply with that message, and therefore you could investigate that as either a disciplinary or some other substantial reason, and ultimately you could dismiss after a full process, in the same way as if they were spreading that message via social media. It's still having a negative impact directly internally, but also on your reputation of your organisation internally as well. Does the vaccine contain meat? My understanding is, and I did look into this because there were concerns of whether it was halal. My understanding is that it doesn't, but I can't for sure say that, and I think that's something that if an individual is specifically concerned about, would have to check with their medical provider. Question relates to liability. In the event that an employee accepts to take the vaccine and thereafter suffers an adverse reaction, or indeed a reaction or death, who would be held liable? Oh, that is such a horrific situation that you would find yourself in if that happened. I think what you need to bear in mind, that if you're going to bring in a policy where you expect people to be vaccinated, and you bring in the policy through consultation and trying to get people to do it voluntarily, and you make it clear that you cannot force them to have a vaccine, but they cannot effectively continue working for you if they don't have the vaccine. So it's still their choice. So ultimately, it's still their choice. And if they suffer an adverse reaction, you'd have to determine in terms of liability, and this is a public personal injury issue, really, rather than employment issue. So I'm going a bit off, of course, in terms of my own expertise, and it's something you'd have to check. But my understanding would be that it's not reasonably foreseeable that they would absolutely have that reaction that result in death, and therefore your policy itself and your decision to ask your staff to take the vaccine, I would think it would be hard to hold you liable for that, but it is something that, as I say, from the reasons why unfair dismissal is a serious concern, is that is an outside chance. Could we have your slide, please? Absolutely, you can have our slides. We'll forward them on. We're also recording this now. No one's on it, and no one's name has been mentioned, so I should have said that at the beginning as well. Apologies. We are recording it, and the recording will also be available. Let's see, if following government guidance on measures to protect and health and safety in the employees not vaccinated, would that not be sufficient to avoid reputational damage on the spread of COVID? Is it not difficult to pin down where the spread arose, so how can it be pinned to a specific non-vaccinated employee? You're absolutely correct. It's virtually impossible to determine exactly how somebody has been infected with COVID, and if you are following public guidance and your staff are complying with health and safety measures, and the vaccine and you have undertaken a programme of notifying staff. I would say notifying staff of the benefits of having the vaccine, and you're not bringing in a policy to force them to, then it is difficult to argue that you are, your organisation is responsible for their getting the COVID virus. But unfortunately, reputational damage doesn't necessarily always go on what is fact. It goes on opinion, and it goes on public opinion, and there's always a risk that if all those factors are tied in, that you have members of staff that have chosen not to be vaccinated against best practice, and you still allow them to go into someone's home, for example, and give that person direct care, then public opinion is going to draw the link between that infection and your organisation. I'm not saying it's fair, but I think it's a possible outcome. If employees are not happy to attend the office, or members of staff who have additional childcare responsibilities, and the possible burden placed on staff who do not. Oh, it's been an absolute minefield, this situation, with you have sections of the community who have had to continue working throughout this process and had to continue homeschooling throughout this process, throughout this pandemic, whereas you've got other people who are, in other business sectors who are on furlough and don't have to attend the office, and it must be very difficult if you're in that position and are being forced to work when you are not happy and you are anxious about infection, and you do have those additional responsibilities. But people that choose not to, then it does place additional burden on other staff, and ultimately this is going to come down to any decision you take. If you factor in all these different competing needs, any decision you take, if it is clear and your rationale is clear, and you will be able to justify it. And so for somebody who doesn't want to attend workplace and they have childcare responsibilities, then if they are working for you and they are required to attend the office, chances are they could be classed as a critical worker, and that removes their childcare responsibility issue. If it's just about anxiety, then unfortunately you are still required to provide the services, and the burden on others would be too great if they didn't attend, and I think that you would be able to make a decision on that basis. Right, I think I've gone through all the questions now. Thank you so much for the questions. That has been, if you've got any other questions that come up as a result of what we've said and you want to contact us directly, my email is there on the screen now, and as I say, we'll send you through our slides this week. Any other questions that come up, please do let us know. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.